Footsteps echoed through the narrow canyon. Garrett Holt crouched behind a boulder, eyes locked on three figures closing in. Then, a flash of red. One man yanked a crude explosive from his coat and hurled it toward the hollow where Margaret and the children hid. Holt burst from cover, snatched it midair, and flung it back just before it erupted. Smoke and shards of stone tore the air. Through the haze, Samuel saw a face burned into his memory. The man who had murdered his father. His pulse thundered, sweat stung his eyes, fingers trembling on the trigger. In that suspended heartbeat, he knew this was no longer about revenge. It was survival, and the choice between sparing a life or ending it forever. California territory, late summer of 1852. The mining town of Cold Hollow sat under a punishing sun, the heat pressing down like an anvil on cracked earth. Dry winds roared down from the Sierra Nevada, rattling loose shutters and carrying the tang of dust into every breath. The gold rush had burned through this place years ago, leaving behind a patchwork of weather-beaten buildings, hard men, and harder luck. By midday, a crowd had gathered in the town square, not for gold, not for justice, but for spectacle. Word had spread fast. Another family, ruined by debt, was to be auctioned off. People came to see the show. At the center of the square stood a battered wooden wagon, its wheels sunk into the dirt like it was too ashamed to move. Inside sat a woman in her 30s, posture straight despite the heat, soot-dark hair pinned back in a plain knot. Her name was Margaret Hale, and on either side of her clung 4 children. Samuel, 13, stood close to his mother, lean and sharp-eyed, with a jaw already set like a grown man's. Beside him, Lydia, 10, held baby Clara against her shoulder, humming something faint to keep the infant from crying. The youngest boy, Noah, 7, stood apart, his gaze restless and mistrustful, scanning the crowd like he already knew how cruel strangers could be. The auctioneer, a red-nosed man in a faded vest, lifted his gavel, his voice loud and dry as the wind. 5 souls, no sickness, just bad luck and unpaid land. Who'll start me at 50? A man near the front, wearing a coat far too fine for this dusty place, raised his hand. $50 for the lot. The older 2 can work, and I'll find use for the rest. Margaret didn't flinch. Her eyes, cool and steady, swept the crowd, searching for something, maybe hope. 75, barked a stocky rancher. That boy can break colts. The bids came slow after that. 75, then 80 from an impatient voice in the back. The auctioneer's eyes darted around, sensing the momentum fading. Then from the shaded porch of the old saloon came a voice low and worn, like boot leather. I'll pay double. The words rolled across the square like a stone in still water. Heads turned. From the shadows stepped Garrett Holt, dust-covered duster, boots scuffed from miles of hard travel, beard masking most of his face. His eyes, pale and unreadable, cut through the murmurs. Double what? The auctioneer asked. Whatever he offered. Holt strode forward without hurry, reached into his coat, and dropped a heavy sack onto the crate beside the auctioneer. It landed with a solid thud, the seam tearing enough to spill a glint of raw, dull gold. The crowd gasped. The auctioneer peered inside, swallowed, and said, More than covers it. I'm not asking for change, Holt said flatly. No one else bid. The gavel came down hard. Sold to Mr. Holt. Margaret rose slowly, baby on her hip. Her gaze met Holt's, hers weary, his unreadable. Without another word, he turned to mount his horse. The Hale family's fate had just been bought, and Cold Hollow would talk about it for weeks. The crowd was still murmuring as Garrett Holt swung into the saddle. He didn't look back. Margaret shifted Clara to her other hip and guided her children down from the wagon. Samuel kept his chin high, Lydia clutched her baby sister tighter, and Noah dragged his feet, his eyes darting to the faces around them, faces that stared too long. At the hitching post, a borrowed mule waited, its coat the color of worn leather. Holt's voice came low, almost an afterthought. Ride with me, no questions, no trouble. Margaret didn't answer, just helped her children onto the mule's back. Samuel sat behind Lydia, steadying Clara with one arm. She walked alongside, one hand resting on the animal's flank, her skirt brushing the dust. Cold Hollow fell away behind them, the sound of clinking glasses and muttered gossip fading with each step. The road ahead stretched into open country, a ribbon of pale dirt winding toward the ridges. Holt rode a few lengths ahead, his silhouette framed against the lowering sun. He didn't turn around, didn't speak. His movements were deliberate, checking the horizon, scanning the brush, as though danger might rise from any shadow. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth. A hawk circled high above, its cry sharp and lonely. Samuel watched it for a while, thinking of the way it hovered before diving, silent and certain. By the time the sky bruised into violet, Holt guided them off the main road to a stand of cottonwoods. The trees huddled close around a patch of bare earth, a narrow stream whispering nearby. "We camp here," Holt said simply. "One night. I'll take you to the settlement by morning." Margaret nodded, though her eyes lingered on him, trying to read the man who had just bought their lives. The sun had dipped below the ridgeline, leaving the cottonwoods shivering in the dusk. Holt dismounted without a word and began loosening his saddle. Margaret stood by the mule, watching as her children slid down stiff-legged from the long ride. Holt tossed a small bundle toward Noah. The boy caught it awkwardly and unrolled it to find a flint striker, some dry grass, and a handful of brittle twigs. "Your job," Holt said simply. Noah's eyes widened. "Me? You're not made of sugar," Holt replied, already turning back to his horse. Noah crouched near the stream bank, fumbling with the flint. Sparks danced but died before catching. Lydia moved as if to help, but Holt lifted a hand without looking at her. "Let him do it." Margaret hesitated, torn between stepping in and letting the lesson play out. After several false starts, a thin curl of smoke rose from the grass, followed by a fragile flame. Noah's face lit with triumph, and Holt gave the smallest of nods before returning to his work. As the fire began to crackle, Margaret crossed to where Holt knelt by his saddlebags. He rolled up his sleeve, reaching for a tin of beans. And that's when she saw it. A brand, faint but unmistakable, burned deep into the flesh of his wrist. The shape was crude but clear, the insignia of a military unit. The edges were puckered as if someone had tried to burn it away. "That scar," she said quietly. "You served." Holt didn't look at her. "Lots of men did. Sonora or earlier?" His jaw tightened. He flicked the lid off the tin and set it by the fire. "I don't talk about it." "Was it war?" she pressed. "Or mercenary work?" He stood, towering over her, the firelight catching in the pale steel of his eyes. "None of your concern." "You bought us," Margaret said, her voice even. "That makes it my concern." For a long moment, only the wind moved between them. Finally, Holt spoke, his tone flat. "I don't like slavers. That's all you need to know." And with that, he walked into the trees, rifle slung across his back, leaving Margaret staring into the fire, her suspicion deepening, her questions unanswered. The last streaks of daylight faded into a bruised purple sky as the cottonwoods whispered overhead. Holt slid from his horse without a word, the leather of his saddle creaking in the cool evening air. Margaret helped the children down from the mule. Their legs were stiff from the long, silent journey. Without preamble, Holt tossed a small cloth bundle toward Noah. The boy caught it clumsily, letting it thud into the dirt before scooping it up. Inside was a flint striker, a twist of dry grass, and a handful of brittle twigs. "Your job," Holt said flatly. Noah blinked. "Me?" "You're not made of sugar," Holt replied, already turning his back to tend his horse. The boy crouched by a small ring of stones and struck the flint. Sparks flared, then fizzled. He tried again. Same result. Lydia started forward to help, but Holt raised a hand without looking. "Let him do it." Margaret's mouth tightened, but she stayed where she was. After a few tense minutes, a curl of smoke rose from the tinder, followed by a weak flame that licked at the twigs. Noah's grin was quick, almost shy. Holt gave a single curt nod before checking his saddle straps. Margaret crossed the clearing to where Holt knelt by his saddlebags. As he reached for a tin of beans, his sleeve fell back, and the firelight caught a mark on his wrist. A deep, puckered brand, the shape of a military insignia burned into the flesh. Her eyes lingered on it. "That scar," she said softly. "You served." Holt didn't look up. "Lots of men did." "Was it Sonora or earlier?" He pried the lid off the tin, his jaw tightening. I don't talk about it. Was it war, she pressed, or mercenary work? He rose to his full height, the shadows cutting sharp angles across his face. None of your concern. You bought us, she said evenly. That makes it my concern. The wind stirred between them, carrying the smell of the campfire. Holt's gaze held hers for a long moment before he spoke. I don't like slavers. That's all you need to know. He turned and walked into the darkness beyond the firelight, leaving Margaret staring after him, her suspicions sharpened, her questions unanswered. By the pale light of early dawn, Garrett Holt crouched near the embers of the dying fire, turning over the words Samuel had spoken the night before. 3 men, a map, a father gunned down. If those men believed the boy remembered their faces, and Holt was sure he did, they would not stop until the family was silenced. When Margaret stirred and began folding the thin blankets, Holt spoke without looking up. We're not going to the settlement. She froze. Why not? Too many eyes, too many mouths willing to sell what they hear. He stood, tightening the cinch on his saddle. We go deeper into the woods, off the trails, where they can't follow. Margaret's gaze flicked toward her children, still sleepy-eyed and rubbing the cold from their hands. And how long do you expect us to hide out there? As long as it takes. From that day forward, Holt set about turning the Hales from passengers into survivors. Samuel was first. Holt handed him a long-bladed knife, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Learn the weight, Holt instructed. Learn the balance. You don't wave it around, you work with it. He showed Samuel how to cut clean, how to keep the edge sharp, and how to strike quickly if there was no other choice. Lydia received a coil of rope. Under Holt's watchful eyes, she learned knots that could hold a shelter against wind, and others that could snare small game. At first her fingers fumbled, but soon she tied each knot with quiet precision, her brow furrowed in concentration. For Noah, Holt's lessons were about the land itself. He taught the boy how to read the language of the forest. Hoof prints pressed deep into mud, branches bent where something large had passed, a patch of moss brushed clean by movement. The ground talks, Holt told him. You just have to learn to listen. They moved slowly, camping near cold springs and beneath thick canopies. Holt checked their back trail at every turn, scanning for signs of pursuit. Margaret watched the changes in her children, how Samuel's grip steadied, how Lydia's hands worked with confidence, how Noah's eyes darted to every shift in the woods. It struck her then, Holt wasn't just leading them deeper into the forest. He was teaching them how to survive in it. The days bled into each other. Long treks under the shadow of towering pines. Nights spent huddled near fires, built small to hide their light. The forest grew colder as autumn deepened, frost biting the air each morning. It was on one of those mornings that Margaret noticed Lydia limping. At first the girl brushed it off, but when Holt ordered her to sit, the truth became plain. The soles of her shoes were worn clean through, the leather cracked and curling away from the stitching. Holt said nothing at first. He knelt by the fire with the quiet precision of a man used to fixing what he could with what he had. From his own saddlebag, he cut strips of leather and laid out a small awl and wax cord. His hands were rough, scarred, but they moved gently as he mended the shoes, reinforcing the seams and patting the soles. When he handed them back to Lydia, she whispered a shy, "Thank you." He only nodded. A week later, Clara fell ill. The baby's skin burned hot, her small breaths fast and shallow. Margaret's fear rose like a tide, but before she could speak, Holt was already packing. There's a town south of here, he said. Half a day if the weather holds. The weather did not hold. By midday, the sky broke open, snow driving sideways in blinding sheets. Holt pressed on, leaning into the wind, his coat stiff with ice. Somewhere in the white silence, a shape lunged from the trees, a mountain cat, its eyes catching what little light remained. Holt's rifle was slung too far to reach, so he drove his knife upward into its chest, shoving the body aside without breaking stride. By nightfall, he returned, boots soaked, blood, his and the cat's, frozen at the hem of his coat. In his hand was a small wrapped parcel, fever powder, dried willow bark, and a bottle of laudanum. Margaret took the bundle, her voice breaking. You could have died out there. Holt shrugged, lowering himself to the fire. She needed medicine. As she prepared the remedy, Margaret watched him in the flickering light. She saw the man beneath the silence, not gentle but steadfast, the kind who would walk through a storm and face teeth and claws if it meant keeping them alive. And something inside her shifted. The signs were subtle at first. A snap branch where none should be, a faint shift in the wind carrying the scent of campfire smoke. Garrett Holt stopped dead on the trail, scanning the ridgelines. He didn't need to see their faces to know. "They're coming," he said. "3 men, maybe more." Margaret's arms tightened around Clara. Lydia clutched her sister's blanket. Samuel's eyes narrowed, already reaching for the knife Holt had given him. Holt led them into a narrow canyon, its high walls curling inward like the throat of a funnel. "We hold them here," he said. He set Samuel to the ridge above, bow and a few arrows in hand, while Holt placed snares and loose rocks where they'd make the most noise. The canyon grew still, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, footsteps. The first figure emerged, a tall man with a red scarf knotted at his throat. Behind him came a man with a jagged scar running from ear to jaw, and the third, silent, his eyes cold and watchful. Samuel froze. That scarf. He knew it, as surely as he knew the smell of his father's old coat. The man who had killed his father was standing below him. A shot rang out, sending one outlaw staggering. Holt moved like a shadow, flanking from the side, his rifle barking once, twice. The third man darted for cover. Then the red scarf man pulled something from his coat, a crude explosive, fuse hissing. He hurled it toward the alcove where Margaret and the children crouched. Holt didn't hesitate. He lunged, snatching the device midair, and hurled it back toward the canyon wall. The blast shook the ground, smoke and dirt billowing upward. Through the haze, Samuel's gaze locked with the killer's. The man's eyes widened in recognition. Samuel's hands trembled on the revolver Holt had given him. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Then Samuel squeezed the trigger. The shot was sharp, final. The man fell, his scarf darkening with dust and blood. Samuel's breath came in ragged bursts as Holt climbed to him, pulling the boy into a fierce embrace. "You did what you had to," Holt murmured. And for the first time, Samuel believed him. The canyon was silent now, the echo of gunfire fading into the wind. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons, clinging to the air like a memory that refused to leave. Samuel stood rigid on the ridge, the revolver dangling from his fingers. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, every breath catching. The man with the red scarf lay below, still and heavy in the dust. For a long moment, Samuel couldn't look away. His stomach turned, his palms slick with sweat. The weight of what he'd done pressed in on him, not just the act, but the finality of it. There would be no undoing this choice. Holt climbed up to him, his boots scraping against the rock. When he reached the boy, he didn't speak at first. He simply reached out, pulling Samuel into his arms. The boy's breath hitched, and the revolver slipped from his grasp into the dirt. "I didn't want to," Samuel choked out, his voice breaking. "I know," Holt said quietly, his grip firm. "But you did what you had to." Samuel's face pressed against Holt's shoulder, the smell of dust and leather grounding him. The tension in his small frame slowly eased, not from peace, but from knowing he wasn't alone in the weight he carried. Margaret watched from below, Clara asleep in her arms, Lydia and Noah clinging close. She saw something change in Holt's expression as he held her son. Something softer, unguarded. For Holt, it was a moment he hadn't expected. He'd carried plenty of men through worse in the past. Comrades, strangers, even enemies. But never a boy who looked to him for more than orders or protection. Samuel wasn't just another life to guard. He was a life Holt couldn't imagine leaving behind. When Samuel finally pulled back, Holt rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, meeting his gaze. "You're not alone in this," he said. It was the truth, and for the first time, Holt meant it as more than a promise. It was a claim. Somewhere between the gunshot and the silence that followed, Holt had crossed a line he never thought he would. He was beginning to feel like a father. After days of quiet travel through frost-tipped pines and rolling meadows, the forest finally broke open to reveal a small settlement nestled in a valley. Smoke curled from the chimneys of scattered cabins, and the faint toll of a chapel bell drifted on the cold air. Garrett Holt reined in his horse at the crest of the ridge. Margaret pulled the mule to a stop beside him, her children shifting restlessly in the saddle. "This is it," Holt said, his voice low. "Safe enough." They descended into the valley at a slow pace. Holt's eyes scanned the town with the same caution he brought to every new place. At the edge of the settlement, he dismounted, adjusted the rifle slung over his back, and checked the cinch on his saddle. "You're leaving," Margaret said, not a question. Holt gave a single nod. "My job's done." She studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded cloth. She pressed it into his hand. Holt unfolded it to find a handkerchief, the stitching uneven but careful. Across one corner, in slightly crooked letters, was his name, Garrett. "Lydia helped with the letters," Margaret said softly. "We wanted your name to stay with us." Holt stared at it for a long moment. "I don't need a husband," Margaret continued, her voice steady but warm. "But they need a father, someone who shows up, someone who stays." His gaze shifted to the children. Samuel met his eyes with a calm, steady look. Lydia gave a small, hopeful smile. Noah raised his hand in a shy wave. Even Clara, perched on Margaret's hip, reached out toward him as if offering something invisible. Holt swallowed hard, his chest tightening in a way he couldn't quite name. For years, he had made leaving a habit, safer than belonging anywhere. But standing here, he realized he didn't want to walk away. He gave a small nod. "Then I'll stay." That night, they built a new fire at the edge of the settlement. 6 figures sat around it, not as strangers bound by chance, but as a family bound by choice. Years later, long after the dust of those days had settled, Samuel would tell the story of Garrett Holt to his own children. He spoke not of the gunfights or the cold nights in the forest, though those had their place, but of the quiet moments, of the way Holt taught him to tie a proper knot, to read the wind before making a shot, to build a fire that would last the night. He told them Holt's lessons weren't just about survival. They were about patience, about standing your ground when fear told you to run, about finding strength in the people who stood beside you. "He showed me how to forgive," Samuel would say, "not just others, but myself." The children would sit wide-eyed by the hearth, imagining the man with the weathered coat and pale, steady eyes, the man who had walked into their father's life a stranger and stayed as something far more. Samuel's voice would always soften at the end. "We weren't bound by blood," he'd tell them, "but he was the first to show me what it meant to belong." Garrett Holt wasn't just the man who saved us. He was our family. Stories like Garrett Holt's remind us that family isn't just the people you're born to. It's the people who choose to stand beside you through storms, danger, and the quiet trials of everyday life. In the America of 1852, survival often depended on grit, loyalty, and a willingness to protect others without expecting anything in return. Those values still matter today. In our modern world, we may not face outlaws in a canyon, but we do face moments that test our courage, moments when we must decide whether to walk away or step forward for someone else. Holt's journey from a lone wanderer to a man who stayed shows us that the greatest victories aren't won with a gun, but with a choice: to belong, to forgive, and to keep showing up. It's a reminder that the scars we carry, like Holt's burned wrist, don't have to define us. Instead, they can become proof of what we've endured and why we keep going. Now I'd like to hear from you. In today's world, what does it mean to choose family? Is it an act of love, of duty, or both? Would you have done what Holt did, risking everything for people you barely knew? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation alive. Thank you for riding with me through this story on the West that never left. If you felt the dust of those canyon trails or the warmth of that fire, please like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next journey into the untold heart of the frontier. Because some stories, like the West, never truly leave us.